In the stillness of the Scandinavian dawn, the world of the Vikings begins not with conquest, but with silence of snow, stone, and sea. Long before the clash of swords echoed across Europe, these northern lands held tightly to myth and memory. Ancient forests stretched endlessly, blanketed in mist, their silence broken only by the creak of pine and the distant cry of a raven. Within these woods and fjords lived tight-knit communities shaped by seasons harsher than most could endure, where survival was intertwined with belief in gods who demanded both reverence and bravery. Here, Norse identity was forged in hardship, rooted in the land and lifted by legend. The early Viking homesteads were built from earth and timber, nestled along icy rivers and fertile valleys. Life was difficult but structured, farming in spring, fishing in summer, preparing for winter with communal labor. Children were taught to track game and recite stories of Odin and Thor. These stories were more than entertainment. They were maps of the moral and mystical world. To grow up Viking was to learn that death was not fear but respected, and that the sagas of one's deeds would long outlive flesh. In these early days, every household was both fortress and hearth, where family history burned beside the firelight. Much of what we now know about the Viking spiritual life is filtered through the later lens of Christianity, but in their time, they saw the world as a great tree, Yggdrasil, spanning 9 realms. From Asgard, the home of gods, to Midgard, the world of men, and down to Hell, the land of the dead, every moment in a Viking's life was thought to echo within this cosmic map. Runes were carved not just for writing, but as sacred tools of power and fate. There was awe in the act of creation, and solemnity in sacrifice, whether animal or human. This worldview gave their lives profound meaning. What made the Vikings so different from other ancient peoples was their blend of the mystical and the practical. They revered the gods, but they also built ships that could slice through waves like knives through silk. Their rituals were filled with song and blood, but they were also keen traders, explorers, and engineers. Before the raids that would make them infamous, they were farmers and poets. To understand the Viking soul is to accept contradiction. Peaceful yet fierce, rooted yet far-traveling, dreamers guided by stars and spirits. Their world was one where the sky could open with light or lightning, and both were sacred. As the 8th century dawned, whispers of movement stirred among these northern shores. Chieftains spoke of expansion, of what lay across the dark waters. Young warriors trained not just to defend, but to journey. Their longships were no longer just fishing vessels. They became dreams made real in wood and sail. Soon, the age of Viking exploration would begin, but it started here in these quiet, wind-swept villages by the fire, where sagas were born and stars named. The sea, always just beyond the tree-line, was waiting. And the Vikings, well, they were listening. The construction of Viking longships was more than engineering. It was a spiritual act. Every curved plank of oak, every nail driven by hand, carried intention. These ships, known as drakers or skaes, were not just tools of war or trade. They were vessels of identity, of lineage, of ambition. Crafted with meticulous care, their keels sliced through both rivers and oceans, whispering to the waves the names of gods and ancestors. Builders selected trees not just for strength, but for spirit. A sacred bond existed between sailor and ship, as if they would remember the forest it once stood in, guiding them home even when stars disappeared. As the first expedition set sail from Scandinavia, the world shifted. The Vikings were not merely raiders. They were explorers, traders, and seekers of fortune. Their route stretched from the ice-crusted shores of Greenland to the golden domes of Byzantium. On every journey, they brought goods, amber, furs, swords, but they also brought stories. These voyages were both economic and existential, a way to map not just the seas, but the soul. The longship itself became a symbol of courage, pushing beyond the known with only the stars, the gods, and their own memory as guides. Life aboard these ships was a test of both spirit and stamina. Warriors rowed with callous hands, faces wet with salt and wind. Yet even here, rituals endured. Offerings were made to Njord, god of the sea, and ravens carved on shields served as both protection and reminder. Songs echoed across waves, stories of previous raids or visions seen in dreams. Fire, when it could be lit, burned low in protected clay bowl, surrounded by hushed voices. This blend of grit and grace defined a Viking voyage. Equal parts storm and serenity, hardship and harmony. As they landed on foreign shores, the Vikings brought with them more than weapons. They brought culture, In Ireland, England, and the Frankish coast, their presence reshaped kingdoms and rewrote histories. To some they were demons, to others necessary traders and allies. They intermarried, built settlements, and left language in their wake. Their arrival was sudden like thunder, but their influence was lasting like rainfall. The longship was no longer just a tool of raiding. It was a bridge between worlds, a moving heart that connected frostbitten fjords with the fertile plains of Europe. Back home, those left behind, wives, children, elders, watched the horizon for signs. A returning ship meant not only news, but wealth, new ideas, and perhaps omens. Women ran farms in their husbands' absence, preserving lineages and maintaining social order. Skalds, poet historians, would sing of voyages, keeping the past alive and sacred. Every voyage outwards was mirrored by a deeper return inward, shaping the heart of Norse identity. The sea gave and took, but always echoed, like a god whispering back the names of those brave enough to challenge it. The Viking worldview was steeped in myth, a rich cosmology where gods walked alongside mortals and fate was woven by unseen hands. At the center of it all stood Yggdrasil, the world tree, connecting 9 realms of existence. The Vikings did not sail blindly into the unknown. They believed the Norns had already spun their destinies. Odin, the All-Father, sacrificed an eye for wisdom and hung from Yggdrasil for 9 days to learn the runes. This act of self-sacrifice defined their code. To suffer was not to lose, but to understand. Every journey became a sacred reenactment of myth. Every storm a test set by the gods. Ragnarok, the prophesied end, haunted their minds, not with fear, but with meaning. In Viking thought, even the gods had an expiration date. Thor would battle the world serpent. Odin would fall to Fenrir, and fire would consume the earth. But this was not mere doom. It was a cycle, from destruction, rebirth. This belief shaped Viking courage. If fate was unavoidable, then one must meet it with open eyes and a steady heart. To die in battle was not an end, but a passage. Valhalla awaited, not as a fantasy, but as a continuation of duty, honor, and camaraderie. Runes, carved into stone or etched onto talismans, carried power. More than letters, they were channels to divine forces. The rune Algies protected warriors. Raidho guided travelers. Young Vikings would be taught the rune songs, a soft chant blending language, magic, and memory. Carving a rune was an act of faith, of precision. Each stroke mattered. It was believed that some berserkers carved runes into their skin before battle to become untouchable, possessed by the fury of the bear or the wolf. These acts weren't superstition. They were beliefs sharpened into ritual. Their myths were not limited to divine realms. Stories of sea serpents, trolls, and hidden lands danced on the edges of memory. Elders would sit by the hearth, spinning tales of creatures lurking beneath waves or wandering forests. These weren't merely bedtime stories. They were warnings, maps of the soul's terrain. The unknown was never empty. It was populated with meaning. Even the aurora borealis was seen as the shimmering armor of Valkyries crossing the sky, choosing the slain. The line between reality and legend was thin, and purposefully so. Through these beliefs, the Vikings found not only identity but resilience. To live was to participate in something eternal, not just a family line or a clan, but a mythic pattern. Every carved dragon head on a longship was a reminder that their lives echoed the gods. The ocean became a sacred place, the axe an extension of fate. Their world was not chaotic. It was meaningful, cyclical, and charged with destiny. In a world where even gods had died, a mortal's courage became divine. The art of shipbuilding was the beating heart of Viking exploration. It began in forest clearings, where seasoned oak was felled, shaped, and seasoned. Shipwrights worked by hand, guided by ancestral knowledge passed down like sacred scripture. The iconic longships emerged not only as tools of war, but as vessels of identity, sleek, symmetrical, and swift. Their shallow keels allowed landings on virtually any shore, empowering the Vikings to appear where least expected and vanish like spirits into the sea mist. Construction was a communal effort, blending utility with artistry. Intricate carvings adorned the hulls, serpents, dragons, and runes that were believed to protect sailors and intimidate enemies. The craftsmanship merged myth and mastery. A ship wasn't merely built. It was born, named, and blessed with rituals invoking Njord, god of the sea. These ornate touches didn't slow them down. Viking ships could outpace many others, slicing through water like blades under a darkened sky. Training to sail these vessels began early. Young warriors learned the rhythm of rowing, the secrets of star paths, and how to read the moods of wind and wave. They memorized coastlines not with maps, but by heart and song. Navigation was an art of feeling and faith, no compass, only instincts sharpened by generations. The sea was their trial and teacher, where discipline and daring were carved deep into the soul. When launched, the longship became a sacred beast. Rowers moved in harmony, led by the beat of a drum or chant. Wind filled the sail, often dyed blood red, giving the ship its soul. These vessels enabled raiding, yes, but also commerce, diplomacy, and discovery. From Ireland to Baghdad, Viking ships carried more than warriors. They transported culture, language, and memory across the map of the known world. For the Vikings, to sail was to live. Every launch was a risk and a rite. They believed each voyage echoed the journey of the gods, threading the realms of men and spirits. These ships were not just technology, but theology carved in wood. And when a warrior died, he might be buried with a ship to carry him across the last horizon. The longship, in all its grace and grit, remains the most powerful emblem of Viking ambition, ingenuity, and myth. When the Vikings set sail, they were not just venturing for gold or glory. They were following the wake of their ancestors' dreams. Navigation across the open seas was an act of immense skill and trust in the gods. With no compasses, they relied on the sun, stars, ocean swells, migrating birds, and even the behavior of sea life. The sunstone, a mysterious, possibly real crystal, was said to help them locate the sun's position on cloudy days. These early mariners merged instinct, myth, and observation into a silent language of direction, shaping some of the most impressive voyages in pre-modern history. Their longships, sleek, flexible, and fast, were not only engineered for speed, but for symbolic power. With dragon-headed prows and intricate carvings, they struck awe into enemies and reverence into those who understood their craftsmanship. The ships could traverse open oceans yet slip into shallow rivers with ease, enabling the Vikings to raid, trade, and settle across vast territories. The rhythmic pull of the oars, the creaking of the mast, and the singing of warriors united by wind and water made every voyage a sacred trial, part test, part tribute. Encounters on distant shores were not always violent. Many expeditions aimed for trade, exploration, and even cultural exchange. In Constantinople, Vikings served as elite guards. In Ireland and England, they built new towns and integrated with locals. They brought with them not only weapons, but stories, gods, and customs, some of which would eventually merge into the fabric of European culture. In these interactions, the Vikings were more than warriors. They were bearers of identity, flowing across borders like the rivers they navigated. Yet no voyage was without danger. Storms could arise suddenly, tossing ships like leaves across black waters. Sea monsters, though perhaps more legend than reality, were deeply believed in, and every strange whale or shadow in the mist was seen as a potential omen. Sailors wore talismans, whispered to wind, and offered small sacrifices to appease Agur, the sea god. Death at sea was not feared but embraced. As long as it was honorable, it led to Valhalla. The ocean itself became both grave and gateway to eternity. When land was finally sighted, a hush often fell over the crew. Whether the destination was a familiar trading hub or a mysterious new coast, each landing held a potential for conflict or communion. As the longship kissed the shore, warriors readied their weapons, traders their coin, and priests their prayers. Every beach became a threshold between safety and danger, past and future. For the Viking, the voyage was never just movement. It was transformation. To cross the sea was to cross into legend. Back home in their Nordic lands, the Vikings lived lives governed by deeply rooted traditions, blending everyday survival with an unshakable belief in the sacred. At the heart of their community stood the Longhouse, a communal structure that was not just a place of shelter, but a hub for storytelling, feasting, and decision-making. The hearth burned constantly, providing warmth and light during the long, harsh winters. It was here that generations passed down wisdom, epic tales, and warnings from the gods. The Longhouse embodied kinship, memory, and endurance. The structure of Viking society was surprisingly complex, built on a system of loyalty, land, and law. Jarls, nobles, carls, freemen, and thralls, slaves, each had defined roles. But even within this hierarchy, honor and reputation could lift a man from obscurity or cast him into ruin. Lawmakers and assemblies, known as things, governed disputes and contracts, emphasizing balance and community justice. The legal codes, recited aloud, were memorized and revered. In a culture where written records were scarce, memory was law, and the spoken word sacred. Religion was not confined to temples, but woven into the rhythm of life. Gods like Odin, Thor, and Freya were not distant figures. They were intimately involved in daily happenings. Offerings were made at stone altars or sacred groves. Runes were carved to invoke divine protection, and seers known as Volvas interpreted dreams, omens, and the future. Rituals marked births, marriages, and deaths, creating a spiritual timeline that framed human existence. To the Vikings, every thunderclap, raven's cry, or strange dream held a message from the divine. Children were taught early about survival, strength, and the gods. Boys learned to wield axes and steer boats, while girls managed households and learned herbal medicine. Storytelling was essential education. Sagas taught not only entertainment, but morality, bravery, and cultural identity. Young listeners grew up knowing they were part of something bigger, that their lives were links in a chain reaching back through ancestors and forward toward fate. In this worldview, the individual mattered, but only as they upheld the values of their clan. As night fell across the north, the skies opened up to one of nature's greatest wonders, the aurora borealis. To the Vikings, these shimmering lights were more than beauty. They were spiritual signs, perhaps reflections of the Valkyries riding across the sky, or the fires of Valhalla itself. Beneath these ethereal veils, warriors and farmers alike looked upward, reminded that they were not alone. The heavens watched, whispered, and warned. Under such skies, even the fiercest grew quiet, and even the hardest life felt connected to myth. Viking trade routes stretched far beyond what most imagine. While tales of their raids dominate legends, these Norse seafarers were also skilled merchants, forging connections across continents. From the icy fjords of Scandinavia, their ships sailed to the bustling markets of Constantinople, the opulent courts of the Abbasid Caliphate, and the sunlit ports of Spain. They traded amber, fur, walrus ivory, and iron for silk, spices, silver, and glassware. These exchanges weren't just economic. They brought cultural fusion, new beliefs, and foreign ideas into Viking life. In Constantinople, known to the Vikings as Miklagard, they found a city of marble, domes, and gold. Many Norsemen entered the service of the Byzantine emperor as elite Varangian guards, their loyalty and ferocity earning high regard. These warriors, though foreigners, stood shoulder to shoulder with the empire's finest, defending its gates and marching in imperial processions. They returned home with tales of immense wealth, strange rituals, and urban marvels that were almost incomprehensible compared to the rugged north. These interactions left subtle imprints on Viking culture. Arabic coins found in Swedish graves, silk threads and burial garments, and Greek icons hidden among pagan symbols reveal a people not closed to the world, but open to its mysteries. The sagas, while fiercely Nordic, began to reflect exotic elements. Descriptions of great cities, faraway deserts, and spices that burned the tongue. The Viking spirit of curiosity was as powerful as their hunger for conquest, and it drove them to explore without losing their core identity. At home, returning merchants and guards were viewed with awe. They brought back exotic goods, but also strange stories. Cities where water ran through pipes, land where the sun burned hotter and longer, people who prayed 5 times a day or bowed to emperors with divine titles. These travelers shaped the oral histories of their homelands, subtly expanding the Vikings' perception of the world. Though fiercely rooted in their own beliefs, the Norse quietly integrated this knowledge, adapting without abandoning tradition. Thus, the Viking world was far from isolated. It was part of a vast network of exchange that stretched across continents and faiths. Their longships cut through borders as easily as they did waves, carrying not just goods, but stories, symbols, and sparks of transformation. In the soft glow of torchlight within their longhouses, such tales were shared quietly before sleep. Tales of the world beyond, where warriors served emperors and furs became silk. Even at rest, the Vikings dreamed of far horizons. Though many picture Viking life dominated by raids and war, their daily routines reflected a more grounded rhythm, rooted in survival, craftsmanship, and seasonal cycles. In the small, clustered villages of Scandinavia, families worked together to farm the land, tend livestock, and craft the tools of life. Homes were built from timber and turf, warm against the northern cold, and filled with the smells of wood smoke, salted fish, and mead. While men often sailed, women managed households, controlled wealth, and preserved culture through story and song. Craftsmanship was central to Viking society. Blacksmiths forged blades and tools from bog iron, Woodworkers carved dragon-headed prows and fine furniture, and weavers spun wool into intricate patterns. These crafts weren't just practical. They held spiritual meaning. Runes were carved into axe heads for protection, and wooden beams bore motifs of gods and beasts. Even the simplest items held layers of story. In this, Vikings saw no boundary between art and utility. Beauty and magic were woven into the everyday. Seasons dictated all. Summer brought long days of travel, trade, and exploration. Winter meant darkness, storytelling, and gathering around the hearth. During Yuletide, homes were lit with candles and the air filled with song and feasting. It was a sacred time when the veil between worlds was thin, when the dead might visit and gods might walk among men. Rituals ensured good fortune, and dreams were shared like gifts, weaving family and faith into the turning of the year. Children learned early to read the skies and forests, to listen for spirits in wind and water. Play was preparation, mimicking swordplay, building miniature ships and chanting verses. Women passed down herbal lore and childbirth customs, while men taught hunting, farming, and law. Memory was their library, and each generation added to its shelves. A child's lullaby might carry traces of old sagas, while a carving on a walking stick might recall a hero long gone. In this daily rhythm, quiet and rich with meaning, the soul of the Viking people was shaped. The clash of steel on foreign shores may echo louder in legend, but it was beside the fire, in the turning of fields, and the whisper gods on wind that true Viking life unfolded. A world of contrasts, fierce and tender, harsh and poetic. A life not just of survival, but of dreaming through snow and storm, always with a horizon in their hearts. To the Vikings, fate was not an abstract idea. It was woven, literally, by the Norns, three mysterious female figures who spun the destinies of gods and mortals alike. Their belief in WIRD, or fate, informed every decision, from voyages to battle. Courage meant accepting one's fate without hesitation, not as resignation, but as harmony with the threads of the universe. A death met with honor brought one closer to Valhalla, while a life lived with cowardice risked eternal disgrace. Rituals, too, were tied to fate. The blot, or sacrifice, was a solemn moment where animals, and sometimes humans, were offered to gods to ensure victory or good harvests. Sacred groves and stone altars stood as thresholds between worlds. The blood spill was believed to bridge the gap between gods and mortals. These rituals were community events, heavy with song, silence, and sacred drink, reminding all that life was a cycle of giving, receiving, and surrendering to the gods. The CRS, or vulva, held immense power in interpreting fate. Often older women with sight beyond sight, they wandered from village to village, chanting in trance, draped in cloaks of animal hide, and carrying staffs carved with runes. In moments of crisis, illness, impending battle, or mysterious omens, the vulva would be called. Her visions guided leaders and comforted the anxious. It was said that she could touch the threads of fate without disturbing them, and that her words echoed across time. Runes were more than writing. They were destiny inscribed in symbols. The runic alphabet, or futhark, was used in charms, inscriptions, and divination. Warriors carved runes onto weapons for strength. Lovers etched them into gifts, and merchants marked them on wares for protection. To cast runes was to ask the universe for a glimpse behind the veil. It was not magic as manipulation, but magic as listening, attuning oneself to the deeper rhythms flowing beneath the visible world. In every storm at sea or uncertain footstep through snow, Vikings felt the nearness of fate. It was not fear but revered, something vast and eternal, like the sea itself. To trust fate was to embrace both glory and grief. It is in this surrender to the unknowable that Viking culture found its spiritual heart, its solemn strength, and its quiet mysticism. Even now, the runes whisper their truths in stone, calling us to remember the courage of those who walked with fate. The sagas, epic oral histories of heroes, voyages, feuds, and vengeance, with a heartbeat of Viking memory. Long before they were written on vellum in Icelandic monasteries, they were shared aloud by firelight in smoky halls. Skalds, the poet historians, committed generations of tales to memory, weaving truth and myth together. Through rhythm, repetition, and vivid imagery, they preserved the wisdom and warnings of the past, ensuring that no deed, whether glorious or disgraceful, was forgotten. Every saga was rooted in place. Windswept fjords, moonlit meadows, frost-covered forests. The geography of the North bled into every tale. Landscapes weren't just backdrops, they were living characters. The cliffs remembered shipwrecks, The valleys echoed with lost battles, and the rivers carried secrets down to the sea. To hear a saga was not only to learn about one's ancestors, but to be reminded that the land itself bore witness, silent but eternal, to every triumph and betrayal. Many sagas blurred the line between historical fact and divine intervention. Kings received visions from Odin. Seers predicted the fall of dynasties. Sea monsters swirled beneath longships. Rather than seeing these as embellishments, Vikings understood the unseen and seen as equally real. Their sagas invited listeners into a world where the veil was thin and gods and men walked side by side. These tales weren't meant to be questioned. They were meant to be felt like the pull of a tide. The sagas also held space for sorrow. They chronicled the unraveling of families, the bitterness of betrayal, and the inevitability of death. Yet, within this tragedy was grace. To mourn well, to die bravely, to speak one's truth even in exile. These were the lessons layered within each tale. A quiet endurance, a fierce dignity, echoed through every stanza. In this way, the sagas were more than entertainment. They were moral compasses, teaching listeners how to live and how to leave the world. With time, sagas were written down, their poetic bones inked onto fragile parchment. Icelandic monks, themselves descendants of Vikings, preserved them during quieter centuries. What was once sung in smoky halls now whispered from ancient pages. Though the age of rating passed, the sagas endured, offering the modern world a window into the Viking soul. To read or hear a saga today is to step into a candlelit hall of memory, where voices long gone still speak in the dark. The Viking ship was not just a vessel of war or trade. It was a living symbol of identity, power, and the freedom of the sea. Each longship was carved with meticulous care. Its dragon-headed prow meant to all enemies and protect the crew from malevolent spirits. The sleek hulls sliced through rivers and oceans alike, giving the Norse unmatched mobility. Shipbuilding was a sacred craft passed down through generations, blending innovation with ritual. To launch a ship was a celebration of spirit and engineering alike. Beyond their aesthetic beauty, longships were marvels of design. The clinker-built technique, overlapping wooden planks, allowed for strength and flexibility. These ships could glide up shallow rivers or endure the fury of open seas. The oarsmen, sitting shoulder to shoulder, moved in synchronized silence, their strokes a rhythm of trust and discipline. Each crew member had a role, a duty, and a loyalty to the ship that mirrored their bond to their clan. Life aboard was brutal and intimate, driven by salt, sweat, and shared purpose. The ships became stages for exploration, conquest, and legend, from the coast of Ireland to the rivers of Rus. Vikings rode their longships into the unknown. They discovered Iceland, reached the shores of Greenland, and even stepped onto North American soil centuries before Columbus. For the Norse, the sea was not a barrier. It was a bridge. These voyages expanded their world, brought them into contact with distant peoples, and seeded stories that would echo for a millennium. But with every launch came peril. Storms could appear without warning. Rocks tore hulls like parchment. Raiders became wreckage in foreign lands. Yet this danger was never avoided. It was embraced. To die at sea, to vanish into mist and myth, was an honorable fate. The longship was not only a means of travel, but a passage into legend. Some were even used as tombs, buried with their captains, sealed beneath earth and stone like dragon bones asleep in the land. Centuries later, some of these ships were unearthed. Astonishing archaeologists with their craftsmanship. The Oseberg and Gokstad ships, preserved in Norwegian soil, seemed as though they might sail again. These relics rekindled public fascination with Viking culture and its spirit of restless discovery. Standing before these ancient vessels today is to feel the echo of waves, the creak of timber, the breath of wind from a time when the world still waited to be known. For the Vikings, home was more than a resting place. It was a heart of kinship, honor, and daily rhythm. Most Norse people were not warriors storming foreign shores, but farmers, herders, and craftsmen tending their lands under ever-changing skies. Longhouses, the communal dwellings of Viking families, were built of timber and turf, their thick walls guarding against Nordic cold. Inside, generations lived together. Stories passed down beside fires that never truly went out. The longhouse was the axis of daily life. Women spun wool, wove textiles, and managed the home, while men tended animals or labored in the fields. Children played in the dirt, mimicking swordplay or watching livestock with innocent awe. The Norse valued strength, but also fairness and hospitality. Guests were fed, even strangers, before names were exchanged. The hall was a space of laughter, learning, and law, where feasts celebrated harvests and disputes were settled beneath carved beams. Norse law was deeply rooted in oral tradition. Local assemblies, known as things, were held in open air, where free men gathered to voice grievances and settle matters. Law speakers recited centuries of memorized statutes, and justice was swift but communal. Honor was sacred. If wronged, one could seek compensation or vengeance. But above all, stability was valued. Even in a rugged world, the Norse sought to balance chaos with order and tradition with adaptation. Seasons guided every task. Winter brought darkness, snowdrifts, and stories. Spring awoke fields and hopes. Summer invited raids, trade, and weddings. Autumn demanded hard labor and preparations for survival. The land was harsh but intimate. Mountains loomed like gods, rivers whispered of spirits, and the sea gave both life and loss. Nature was a constant presence, shaping Norse minds to be both fierce and reverent, always aware of time's fleeting gift. Despite harsh conditions, Viking families endure with creativity and strength. Wood carving, metalwork, and poetry enriched their world. Evenings were filled with skaldic songs, tales of Odin's wisdom or Thor's might. These weren't mere diversions. They were affirmations of identity. In the flicker of hoofire and under vast northern skies, the Norse kept alive a culture both resilient and poetic, where home was a fortress of memory, myth, and meaning. As Viking society matured, so did its artistry and cultural expressions. The Norse world wasn't just one of conquest. It was filled with creativity, storytelling, and craftsmanship. Artisans carved dragon-headed ships with intricate knots, while runestones commemorated fallen loved ones in curves and lines that carried spiritual weight. These designs weren't just decorative. They symbolized the interwoven nature of fate, gods, and mortal lives. From brooches to bedposts, Viking art pulsed with both purpose and pride. Language was equally revered. The Vikings wrote using runes, etched into stones, tools, or talismans. Each rune held power, embodying sounds and concepts that bridged the physical and the mystical. The Eddas, epic poems of gods and heroes, were first passed orally, memorized by skalds who sang them beside flickering flames. Even long after conversion to Christianity, these verses preserved a fiercely independent voice, rich with awe for nature, the cosmos, and inner strength. Music and performance played a quieter but vital role in Viking society. Lyres, flutes, and simple drums accompanied chants or tales. In the longhouse's warm belly, these songs softened the edges of winter, turning hard nights into shared comfort. Skalds, part poet, part historian, were cherished figures. Their verses remembered lineage, praised bravery, and warned of hubris. Every note and word added to a living memory, carried forward like echoes in a fjord. In death, too, the Norse expressed beauty and belief. A chieftain might be buried with weapons, jewelry, even a ship, gifts of the journey to Valhalla. Burial mounds dotted the Scandinavian landscape, rising like silent sentinels. These were not morbid places, but testaments to remembrance. Women were honored with equal splendor, especially those seen as seeresses or protectors of family legacy. Every grave told a story, and every offering whispered hope. Through creation and commemoration, the Vikings stitched their identity into the world. Their sagas, carvings, and melodies were not only reflections of myth, but affirmations of life's meaning. In an age of survival and conquest, these cultural expressions serve as a compass pointing inward, toward honor, memory, and shared understanding. Viking art did not simply decorate. It narrated, cautioned, and preserved. And in that preservation, it continues to whisper across time, carrying the soul of the people forward into memory and night. Through creation and commemoration, the Vikings stitched their identity into the world. Their sagas, carvings, and melodies were not only reflections of myth, but affirmations of life's intensity and brevity. Even in everyday tools, axe handles, drinking horns, shields, there were marks of pride, craftsmanship, and spiritual symbols. A spoon might bear the tree of life, a sword hilt, the binding ribbon of fate. In this way, art and function merged, imbuing the ordinary with the sacred. As Christianity spread across the Viking world, its symbols began appearing alongside pagan ones. Crosses were carved next to Thor's hammer, and churches rose beside ancient burial mounds. Some Vikings resisted, others embraced a new faith, while preserving their ancestral lore. The spiritual duality didn't fracture their culture, it deepened it. Old gods faded into poetry, while new saints joined them in stained glass. The resulting blend was not erasure, but transformation. Viking society also saw internal transformation. As raiding gave way to settlement, trade, and diplomacy, the sword became less dominant. Towns like Birka, Hedeby, and Jorvik blossomed into vibrant trade centers. Markets brimmed with silks, spices, amber, and glass, echoes of the Silk Road and Arabian dunes. These coastal hubs became cosmopolitan, filled with language, scent, and barter. The Viking was no longer just a warrior, but a merchant, negotiator, and voyager of ideas. Yet not all change came peacefully. Some Norse rulers sought to consolidate power, founding early kingdoms. Laws were codified, and assemblies, called things, brought clans together to settle disputes. Justice was delivered through communal consensus, but also through exile, trial, or vengeance. These evolving structures laid the groundwork for future monarchies, but retained the Viking spirit of rugged independence. Power was claimed, but always contested, with sharp tongues or sharper blades. Through all this evolution, the Norse imagination endured. Stories of Odin, Loki, Freya, and distant worlds like Asgard and Helheim continued to be told by firelight. Even as politics shifted and religions intertwined, the sagas remained. They were not just tales of the past, but blueprints for resilience, courage, and complexity. The Vikings never truly vanished. They simply wove themselves into the world's myth, leaving behind echoes as deep as the fjords they once called home. As Viking influence reached its peak, their presence was felt not only in battlefields and trade ports, but in the very language and customs of the regions they touched. In England, Norse words like sky, egg, and window quietly entered the local lexicon, echoing centuries later in everyday speech. In Normandy, Viking settlers became dukes, blending with Frankish aristocracy. Even in Russia, the word Rus, from which the country draws its name, is traced to these seafaring outsiders who became rulers, blending legacy with geography. Yet, as borders expanded and empires rose, the Viking world began to recede. The relentless pressure of Christian kingdoms, the rise of centralized power, and the changing needs of society all played their part. Longships gave way to castles. The hunger for glory turned toward administration. The last great Viking kings, like Harald Hardrada, fought to preserve the old way. But at Stamford Bridge in 1066, his death signaled the twilight of an age. The Viking saga closed not with disappearance, but absorption. Though the raids had ended, the legends thrived. In Iceland, where oral traditions found a home, scribes recorded the great sagas by candlelight. These epic tales of feuds, voyages, gods, and ghosts offered not just entertainment, but an entire philosophy. The Eddas became more than literature. They became a mythic mirror in which the Norse saw both their past and their values. Through these pages, the voices of ancient skalds still speak across time, whispering dreams of fire and frost. Meanwhile, the material world of the Vikings lay buried, until rediscovery awakened it. In peat bogs and fjords, archaeologists unearthed ships, weapons, brooches, and bones. These relics, preserved by earth and time, told of craftsmanship, travel, and belief. The O-spurred ship, perfectly intact, revealed the care with which Viking nobles were buried. Each item, a carved sled, a woven tapestry, a comb, carried meaning. These were not mere warriors, but artists, thinkers, builders of a complex and sacred world that extended beyond the reach of their blades. Today, museums echo the stories of those longships. Exhibits in Oslo, Dublin, and York display axes with worn handles, bones with healed scars, and gods chiseled into amber. Children trace runes with curious fingers. Artists reimagine Odin and Freya in graphic novels and films. The Vikings live again, not as raiders, but as symbols of endurance, adaptation, and mystery. Their legacy is not just war, but wonder. It is the northern light of cultural survival, shimmering across centuries of change. As Viking warriors began to settle in distant lands, their world expanded in ways both subtle and dramatic. Scandinavians didn't just raid, they built, traded, and formed alliances. In the British Isles, they became farmers and governors. In Normandy, they became dukes. These weren't mere conquests, they were cultural mergers. Norse languages blended with local tongues. Viking gods stood beside Christian saints in whisper belief. Children in these new worlds bore names drawn from both lineages, and ancient sagas were passed down in new dialects. As the Norse adapted, their reputation transformed. Once feared, they became landlords and diplomats. Markets bustled with traders of all ethnicities, Danes, Saxons, Franks, and Slavs, sharing goods and laughter. Coins minted in York bore Norse inscriptions, yet the king was Christian. Law codes began to incorporate Viking customs. This was not the fall of a culture, but its rebirth in new soil. From terror rose community. From isolation came integration. They were no longer strangers at the shore. They were the ones lighting hearts inland. However, this peaceful integration did not erase memory. Across Scandinavia, the sagas began to flourish. These oral epics, told beside fires and woven into winter feasts, preserved the heroic age of the sea kings. Skalds, poets and keepers of memory, chanted tales of Ragnar, of Sigurd and the dragon, of doomed love and brave deaths. The spoken word became the bridge between generations. As swords dulled, voices sharpened. Through these tales, even a farmer's son could feel the echo of thunder from Thor's hammer. The Norse influence even reached the Byzantine Empire, where elite Viking mercenaries formed a Varangian guard, personal protectors of the emperor. Here, in marble palaces under Mediterranean stars, Norsemen wore silk and wielded curved blades. Yet they remained who they were, honor-bound, loyal, fierce. Some carved runes into the walls of Constantinople to mark their presence, leaving behind graffiti like echoes of longship sails. Their oaths were sacred, their presence feared and respected in equal measure. From fjords to foreign courts, the Viking shadow lingered. The Viking Age, they say, ended with Christian conversion and centralized rule. But this is only partially true. What truly faded was the need for raids. For the world had opened, and the Norse found other paths. Their gods remained in stories, their spirit in ships and sagas. As bells replaced horns and altars replaced stones, the northern soul lingered in quiet resilience. The Vikings did not vanish. They became part of the world they once tried to conquer. And in doing so, they endured. While the Vikings adapted to new lands and influences, their connection to nature and the unseen world never faded. Deep in the Scandinavian forests, the old rites continued. Sacred groves whisper with stories older than runestones. Seers, known as Volvas, still trace futures in bones and smoke. These were women of power, cloaked in furs, respected and sometimes feared. In silence and shadow, they communed with spirits, interpreting dreams, storms, and sudden silences as messages from beyond. They were the soul keepers of the old ways. Even as Christianity spread, the line between faiths was often blurred. In remote villages, prayers were offered at church altars and pagan stone circles alike. Thor's hammer was carved discreetly beside Christian crosses. Baptisms were followed by toasts to the ancestors. Clergy sometimes tolerated the blending of rites. Understand it was not heresy, but a cultural transition. For the Norse people, abandoning their gods was an erasure. It was a quiet layering. Their beliefs didn't vanish. They became part of the landscape's memory. The rhythm of the old calendar endured as well. Solstices and equinoxes still marked time, bringing festivals that mixed Christian saints with Norse legends. Yule, once sacred to Odin, became Christmas in spirit, but not entirely in symbolism. Bonfires still roared on Midwinter's Eve. Mead still flowed. Songs echoed with echoes of both gospel and saga. These were not contradictions. They were harmonies. The Norse spirit had simply woven itself into a broader tapestry, a quiet form of resistance and remembrance. In private, many still honor their ancestors through small altars or whispered names over hearth flames. The Norse concept of fylgja, a spiritual companion or ancestral guide, remained central. These were not mere ghosts, but guardians passed from generation to generation. Stories were told not just to entertain, but to remember. A child might grow up hearing how their great-grandfather once sailed to Vinland, guided by a raven that appeared in every dream. These tales rooted identity deeper than blood. Thus, the Viking legacy lived on, not just in weapons or ships, but in silence and snow, in story and spirit. The age of raids and glory may have passed, but the age of memory had only begun. Wherever a fire was lit in the dark north, a part of that ancient world flickered to life. And in those quiet hours before sleep, when wind rattles windows and stars gleam coldly, one might still hear the echo of distant oars, rowing through time itself. The enduring legacy of Viking voyages extended far beyond conquest. It settled deep within language, law, and lore across Europe. In England, the Danelaw left traces not just in borders, but in words still spoken today. Sky, window, and knife owe their roots to Old Norse. The Icelandic sagas preserve a narrative tradition so powerful that historians today consider them essential chronicles of the Viking spirit. These stories, half myth, half memory, continue to shape how the world understands the fierce yet poetic Norse world. Even in places of Vikings had only fleeting contact with, their memory persists in uncanny forms. Irish legends speak of fierce sea kings who vanished as suddenly as they appeared, and in parts of Russia, tales of tall northern warriors echo in folk songs. Some of these traces are linguistic, others genetic, and still more embedded in architecture or buried treasures found beneath modern cities. Their presence is like a ghost current, felt more than seen, but unmistakably powerful. The very concept of the Viking has evolved into a symbol of both awe and ambiguity. Once feared as ruthless marauders, they are now romanticized in modern culture, heroes, explorers, even spiritual ancestors of fierce independence. TV shows and games often exaggerate their violence, but beneath that spectacle lies a quieter truth. These were people who balanced poetry and warfare, faith and doubt, home and exile. Their duality makes them endlessly fascinating and deeply human. The Northern Lights, which once guided longships through icy seas, now illuminate museums and scholarly debates. Artifacts once wielded in battle are displayed in glass cases, revered for their craftsmanship and context. Rune stones that once stood alone in desolate fields are now studied by linguists and historians. Yet these items carry more than facts. They hold echoes of hands that shaped them, eyes that stared into the same stars we do. In this way, the Vikings are never entirely gone. Ultimately, the Viking story endures not because of their power, but because of their ability to change, absorb, and inspire. They remind us that identity is not fixed but forged across voyages, through hardship, through faith, through the stories we choose to tell. As the last ember of the fire dims and the sea falls still, their tale settles not as a roar but a lullaby, a soft promise that the spirit of discovery never truly sleeps. As the Viking Age drew to a close, the Norse world began to absorb the changing tides of faith and governance. Christianity, once viewed with suspicion, became an anchor for many former warriors and kings. In Norway and Denmark, wooden churches with intricate carvings rose where long houses once stood. These new spiritual centers often retained Norse motifs, dragons, knots, and runes woven into the Christian iconography. Rather than erasing their past, the Vikings transformed it, blending old gods with new beliefs in a uniquely northern expression of faith. This transition was not without tension. Some communities clung to Odin and Thor, resisting the arrival of monks and bishops. Others embraced baptism, but secretly honored their ancestral rites, burying crosses beside amulets of Mjolnir. The spiritual landscape of the North became one of duality, an outward Christianity covering an inward echo of older powers. Burial practices shifted. Mound graves gave way to Christian cemeteries, yet grave goods sometimes lingered. The soul's journey remained sacred, whether guided by Christ or the Valkyries. In Iceland, the sagas blossomed during this time of transition. While kings wrote laws and priests built churches, poets captured the spirit of the age. The island Dingisogre preserved memories of heroic voyages, blood feuds, and divine omens, even as their tellers lived in Christian societies. These tales, shaped by oral traditions and eventually written in vellum, became the cultural bedrock of the Norse legacy. More than mere legends, they were the voice of a people reconciling who they had been with who they were becoming. Trade networks, once powered by warships, now sustained cities and courts. Viking ports evolved into bustling towns. Birka, Dublin, and York grew under new banners, but bore the bones of old Norse planning. Ships still sailed, but more often carried grain and silver than swords. Warriors turned merchants, skalds became clerks, and children grew up with Latin prayers instead of rune chants. Yet in the quiet, the sea still whispered the old names, and the wind carried stories in every gust. Thus, the twilight of the Viking world was not an end but a transformation. Their longships gave way to galleons, their runes to scripture, but their spirit endured, in resilience, in craftsmanship, in reverence for land and sea. What began with raids ended with reinvention, a quiet merging of myth and reality. As the northern lights shimmered across a gentler age, The echo of Viking oars still stir beneath the waves, softly rowing into the stories we tell before we sleep. As centuries passed, the legacy of the Viking voyages faded from daily life, but endured in whispers, carved into stone, sung in sagas, and etched into the hearts of descendants. The once feared sea kings became figures of fascination, not terror. Their tales morphed from history into legend, softened by time, wrapped in mystery. In villages across Scandinavia, grandmothers told bedtime stories of bold explorers who sailed beyond the edge of the world, guided by ravens and stars. These stories, passed from voice to voice, reminded listeners that history breathes not only in facts but in feeling. The Longships became metaphors for courage, the gods, symbols of nature's power, and the fjords, sacred places where the veil between worlds thinned. To sleep under the northern sky was alive beneath a living myth, where trolls whispered from caves and runes glowed with forgotten wisdom. The Viking world, though long gone, lingered like a soft drumbeat beneath the soil. Museums and scholars would later piece together the scattered fragments. Bones and barrows, brooches and peat, were from ships buried in clay. With careful fingers, they reconstructed the arc of Viking history, not to tame it, but to better understand it. Yet no exhibit, no paper, could fully contain the awe of standing where those ancient boots once walked or hearing the wind hum through ruins once crowned by shields. The past, when quiet, speaks loudest. In the lands where they once ruled, festivals now rise in their honor. Drums beat beside bonfires. Reenactors wear hand-stitched tunics, and longships, faithfully rebuilt, glide once more across the fjords. But these are celebrations not of conquest, but of memory. A people whose stories were nearly lost now find themselves reborn in tradition, reverence, and quiet reflection. The Viking spirit survives, not in violence, but in imagination, in a hush of snowy forests and a hush before dreams. So now, as you lie in the warmth of your bed, remember the rhythm of the oars and the hush of the tide. Let the stories of bold sailors, gentle poets, and sacred fjords carry you into rest. Their world was not just steel and storm, but silence and song. Close your eyes, traveler time. Let the wind guide your dreams where the northern lights still shimmer, and the Vikings sail forever,